Reason number 6 is about the integration of our military policy, integration of our immigration policy. On the military side, with interoperability, our Canadian forces are less and less able to function independently from American operations. Now, most Canadians believe profoundly in our ability as a nation to work for peacekeeping worldwide. But under increasing military integration, our forces will not have the capacity to do that. Recently, in February, there was also a secret agreement that was signed between the Canadian military and the U.S. military, allowing the U.S. military to operate on Canadian soil under U.S. command, if it has the permission of the Canadian government. Now, how did we find out about this? Well, the Canadian government kept it secret, so did the Canadian military. The U.S. military, though, broadcast it on their website. So Canadians found out through the U.S. that this agreement had been signed on February 14th. On immigration policy, what we have seen is a drive for temporary foreign workers in Canada, as is in the United States, to harmonize our standards to American standards on immigration policy. Now, these are individuals who effectively are indentured servants. They come to Canada, they have no rights for the labor standards, for health and safety laws that Canadians enjoy. They are brought in for a specific company purpose, and if they lose their job, or if they are fired, or if they quit, they are sent home. That is not the kind of society that we want to see. And yet, the Immigration Act that has just been inserted into the budget bill, you may have heard, in Ottawa, does exactly that, favoring temporary workers rather than building the kind of strong immigrant communities that we have in this country, that has built this country. Reason number 7, it's about our water. As part of the initial negotiations around the SPP, it is very clear that bulk water exports are on the table. And as I mentioned earlier, the most heavily censored documents that we've been able to obtain are ones that have some mention, though we're not sure exactly what, around water. And the Council of Canadians has done particularly good work on this issue. Now, Canada has vast water resources, but our renewable water resources are the equivalent of that of the United States. In other words, we have a very large bank account, but a very low interest rate. 20% of the world's fresh water, only 6% of the world's renewable fresh water. If we start looking at water diversions, we are not only doing irreparable damage to our ecology and our environment, we are also essentially losing water resources that we will never get back. And yet, bulk water diversions and water exports are part and parcel of these negotiations. Now, bulk water exports are equally dangerous because under NAFTA already, once water is treated as a commodity, it is subject to Chapter 11. How many of you have heard of the Chapter 11 provisions? A lot of folks, yeah. And that's good. This is something Canadians need to know more about. Under Chapter 11, if a company is denied the ability to make profits, they can sue the government. So once any provincial jurisdiction in the country approves bulk water exports, other companies can apply for similar permits from other jurisdictions. If they are denied that bulk water export permit, they can sue the government. So we lose either way. Either we have to submit to that bulk water export permit, or we have to pay compensation. Give you a good example, Ethel Corporation in Canada produced a product, a neurotoxin. Nobody actually contested the fact that it had huge health impacts. When the Canadian government banned the product, everybody in this room helped cough up a compensation package under Chapter 11 that cost Canadian taxpayers $15 million. It is not inconceivable that bulk water exports will be subject to the same kind of compensatory clause. 8, it's about our energy resources. Now, I'll come back to this issue of the Standing Committee on International Trade and the only hearings that have been held thus far on the SPP. Back in the spring 2007, I had been trying for a year to get Liberals and Conservatives to agree to have hearings on the SPP. And they kept saying, no, we're not interested. Canadians aren't interested. And then they decided they wanted to go on a junket to Singapore. Now, the thing about parliamentary committees is you have to have unanimous consent from all 4 parties to go on a trip. So they wanted to go to Singapore, and I said, well, you can go to Singapore, but only if you give Canadians hearings into the SPP. And next week, the following week, hearings began on the SPP. They continued for 4 weeks. And they ended with Gordon Laxer. Gordon Laxer being one of the foremost experts on energy policy in Canada. He lives in Alberta. He's actually the executive director of the Parkland Institute. Knows energy policy like no one else. And he came forward to the committee and started talking about what we have given away already under NAFTA. Under NAFTA, the proportionality clause, we are obliged to continue to share the same amount of oil and gas into the United States regardless of what the supply is. In other words, if we reduce our supply due to cutoff of imports from other parts of the world, such as Middle East, if we have a reduced supply, we still have to send 65% of our oil and 65% of our natural gas to the United States. Now, Ontario and Quebec get most of their oil from the Middle East right now. So in the event of a major supply shortage, we will still be sending exports to the US while literally people in Eastern Canada are freezing in the dark. Gordon Laxer talked about that. He talked about under the SPP a drive to make our energy sovereignty even more subject to Washington. In other words, under energy security, which is part of the discussions around the SPP, Washington will make the decision about the allocation of Canadian energy resources. As he was speaking, you could see the Conservatives realizing, my goodness, we don't want to get this out in the public. The chair of the committee, Leon Benoit, freaked. He left the committee, which shut down the hearing, and since then, we've been trying to convince Liberals and Conservatives to restart the hearings into the SPP. So I ask you tonight, you can be a big help. If you go on the House of Commons website, you call up the Standing Committee on International Trade, and you let those members know you want to hear about the SPP, you want the International Trade Committee to restart those hearings into the SPP. Reason number 9. The SPP is essentially the softwood lumber sellout writ large. I come from British Columbia, but those of you who know Northern Ontario have seen the same thing. The softwood lumber sellout essentially gave a veto over any changes to forestry practices to Washington, D.C. Since the softwood lumber sellout was implemented, we've lost thousands of jobs across the country. In my city of New Westminster, 3 mills have closed in the past year. And we've seen a hemorrhaging of jobs because we cannot change our forestry practices anymore. Now, under the SPP, essentially that economic decision-making power passes from Canadian citizens, from Canadian governments, to Washington, D.C. It is the softwood lumber sellout writ large. Which brings me to reason number 10, why the NDP is opposing the SPP, why we're going across the country at public meetings, why we're speaking out. If we lose the ability to manage our energy resources, we lose our ability to be stewards of our water resources, we lose our ability to set in place environmental policy, safeguards, to ensure that health and safety, drug safety, transportation safety, food safety is a domain of our citizens, democratically elected representatives. As Canadians, being able to make those choices about what kind of society we want to see, I ask you, what is left? The SPP is a one-way trip down a one-way street that Canada cannot come back from. And that is why the NDP is speaking out against the SPP across the country. We're asking people to speak out, to talk to your friends and family and neighbors, because this is not an issue that is front and center on the national or CTV national news. It's not something that journalists are talking about. It is an issue that has profound repercussions for our country, for our children, and for our children's children. That is why we believe it is essential to stop the SPP process. And the next election campaign, we believe, will be a sort of referendum on the SPP. We're asking Canadians who are concerned about the issue to get involved and to fight back and to reclaim our country.